Officer Ryan Mitchell and his German Shepherd, Duke, were conducting their routine inspection at JFK's International Terminal when Duke suddenly froze. His ears perked forward, his body tense as a drawn bowstring. In an instant, Duke lunged toward an expensive leather suitcase on the conveyor belt, refusing to back away despite Ryan's commands, an unprecedented behavior for the highly disciplined K-9 officer who had never once disobeyed in 7 years of service. For 2 long minutes, security protocols halted operations across the busiest terminal in America's largest airport. The silence punctuated only by Duke's persistent whining. When officers finally pried open the suitcase, what Ryan discovered inside made his blood run cold, transported him back to the blood-stained deserts of Afghanistan, and would change the course of not only his career, but the lives of countless endangered creatures waiting to be rescued around the world. Leave a like and share your thoughts in the comments along with the city you're watching from now. Let's continue with the story. JFK International Airport stood as a monument to America's gateway to the world, a sprawling complex where over 60 million souls passed through each year. In the controlled chaos of Terminal 4, where international flights disgorged passengers and cargo from every corner of the globe, Ryan Mitchell had spent the past 8 years of his life searching for the things people tried to hide. At 42, Ryan carried himself with the unmistakable bearing of a military man. His close-cropped salt and pepper hair and the scar that traced his left jawline told stories of his 14 years as an Army Ranger, including 3 tours in Afghanistan. His weathered face had settled into the quiet dignity of a man who had seen too much, but kept moving forward anyway. The other officers called him Steady Mitch, reliable as sunrise and just about as talkative. Duke, his 7-year-old German Shepherd partner, was the finest K-9 officer in the unit. His dark, intelligent eyes missed nothing, his training impeccable. What few people knew was that Duke had begun his training under Ryan's late wife, Emily, a wildlife veterinarian whose gentle hands had shaped the dog's earliest lessons. When cancer took Emily 2 years ago, Duke had become more than Ryan's partner. He was the last living connection to the woman Ryan had built his life around. The apartment they shared in Queens was more Duke's home than Ryan's these days. Ryan just existed there, moving through the routines of survival without truly living. The photographs of Emily remained where she'd placed them. Her collection of wildlife conservation books gathered dust on shelves, and the scent of her favorite jasmine tea had long since faded from the kitchen. Captain Mark Stevens ran the K-9 unit with military precision and fatherly concern. At 50, his career was winding toward retirement, and he watched over Ryan with the worried eyes of someone who recognized grief's dangerous undertow. "You're the best handler we've got, Mitchell," he'd say during their monthly check-ins. "But you've got to find your way back to the land of the living." Dr. Sarah Thompson had recently joined the wildlife trafficking task force that occasionally consulted at JFK. At 35, she had established herself as one of the leading experts in exotic animal medicine and rehabilitation. Her auburn hair and direct gaze reminded Ryan just enough of Emily to make him uncomfortable when their paths crossed. The morning had begun like any other for Ryan and Duke. They'd arrived for the 6 a.m. shift, grabbed coffee in the break room, where Ryan exchanged the usual nods with fellow officers, and headed to their post at the International Baggage Claim. Terminal 4 handled flights from all corners of the earth. Today's early arrivals included planes from Dubai, Singapore, and Kiev. The conveyor belts churned endlessly, disgorging the possessions of thousands of travelers into the fluorescent-lit cavern of America's front door. "Standard sweep, Duke," Ryan murmured, unclipping the lead to give his partner freedom to work. This was their dance, methodical, practiced, and thorough. Duke moved with purpose, his nose tracing invisible scent trails through the air as they walked the perimeter of the baggage claim area. Ryan watched his partner with pride. Drugs, explosives, restricted agricultural products. Duke could pinpoint them all with uncanny accuracy. The Kiev flight's luggage had just started circulating when Duke's behavior changed. Ryan noticed it immediately, a shift in posture, a tightening across the shepherd's shoulders. Duke's nose lifted higher, his pace quickened. Ryan followed, staying close but not interfering. This was the art of their partnership, knowing when to lead and when to follow. When Duke froze beside an expensive leather suitcase, Ryan recognized the alert posture. But something was different. Instead of sitting calmly to indicate a find, Duke began to whine a high, urgent sound Ryan had never heard from him before. "What you got, boy?" Ryan murmured, approaching cautiously. The suitcase was large, expensive-looking, with brass fittings and leather straps, no name tag, just a routing label showing it had traveled from Kiev to Istanbul to JFK. Duke's whining intensified. Then, breaking every protocol in his training, the shepherd lunged forward, pawing frantically at the suitcase, refusing Ryan's command to back away. "Mitchell, control your dog," Officer Ramirez called from across the terminal, his face tightening with concern. "Something's wrong," Ryan replied, his instincts firing warning signals. "This isn't drugs or explosives. He's not giving me the usual alert." Travelers started noticing the commotion. Forming a wary circle around the scene, Ryan signaled to the security desk, and within moments, the standard protocols kicked in, the conveyor belts grinding to a halt. Announcements directing travelers to stay back, the quiet urgency of security personnel clearing the area. Captain Stevens arrived, his face tight with concern. "Bomb squad's on standby." "What are we dealing with?" "I don't think it's explosives, sir," Ryan answered, still struggling to keep Duke at heel. "I've never seen him react this way. It's something else." "You want to stake lives on a hunch." "Mitchell," Stevens challenged, but his tone held more question than rebuke. Ryan looked down at Duke, who continued his frantic pawing and whining. "Yes, sir. I'd bet my badge on it." After a tense debate, they compromised, moving the suitcase to a secure inspection room rather than the outdoor blast containment area. Ryan noticed tiny air holes punched along the suitcase's edge, nearly invisible unless you were looking for them. His stomach tightened with dread. In the sterile white inspection room, with minimal personnel present, Ryan carefully approached the suitcase. Duke's behavior had escalated to pacing and more insistent whining. "Stand back," Stevens ordered as the security tech prepared to open the case. The latches clicked open one by one. Ryan held his breath. The lid lifted slowly, revealing first a layer of packing material, then beneath it, "Jesus Christ," the tech whispered. 3 tiger cubs, no bigger than house cats, lay motionless in the suitcase. Their orange and black striped coats were dull, their little sides barely moving with shallow breaths. Around them, the packing material was soiled, and the stench of urine and fear filled the small room. Ryan felt the floor shift beneath him, reality bending as the room around him faded, and he was suddenly back in Afghanistan, the scorching heat, the raid on the warlord's compound, the tiny tiger cub they'd found chained in a filthy courtyard. He'd tried to save it then, had carried it for miles, but it had died in his arms before they reached base. Emily had wept when he told her the story over a scratchy satellite call. "Mitchell, stay with me," Stevens was saying, his voice cutting through the flashback. "I need you focused." Ryan blinked back to the present. "They're alive, but barely. We need a wildlife vet now." "Protocol says," Stevens began. "To hell with protocol," Ryan cut in, already pulling out his phone. "These cubs have hours, maybe minutes. We wait for Fish and Wildlife to process paperwork. They die." Something in Ryan's voice must have reached Stevens, who nodded curtly. "Make the call. Your responsibility." Ryan's fingers found a contact he hadn't used in months. Dr. Sarah Thompson. As the phone rang, Duke had somehow slipped past the others and now stood sentinel beside the suitcase. His body curved protectively around the cubs, his eyes fixed on Ryan with an almost human intensity. "Thompson," a crisp female voice answered. "Sarah, it's Ryan Mitchell, JFK K9. We have an emergency, 3 tiger cubs, smuggled, critical condition. I need you here now." The next hour passed in a blur of urgent activity. Sarah Thompson arrived in record time, her vehicle screaming to a halt outside the terminal's security entrance. Medical kit already in hand as she was escorted through the maze of corridors. Ryan had moved the cubs to a makeshift care station in the security office's break room. Commandeering the space with a quiet authority that brooked no argument. "How long have they been like this?" Sarah asked, not looking up as she immediately began examining the first cub. Her hands moved with practiced efficiency, checking vital signs, hydration, pupillary response. Unknown. The flight from Kiev was 10 hours, but they could have been in that suitcase longer. Ryan stood back, giving her space to work, though Duke remained pressed against his leg, trembling slightly. "They were already in rough shape when we found them." Sarah's face tightened as she worked. "They've been drugged probably to keep them quiet during transport. Dehydrated, malnourished." She glanced up at Ryan, her green eyes sharp with professional concern. "I need to get IVs started. Do you have a warming blanket?" Ryan improvised with emergency thermal blankets from the first aid kit while Sarah prepared tiny IV lines for each cub. The smallest one, a female with unusually dark markings, seemed worst off, her breathing shallow and irregular. "This little girl's in trouble," Sarah murmured, her fingers gently probing the cub's abdomen. "She's got fluid in her lungs. Probably pneumonia from the confined space and poor air circulation." Captain Stevens appeared in the doorway, his face a storm cloud. "Mitchell, we've got Fish and Wildlife on the way, and I've got brass breathing down my neck about proper channels. This isn't standard procedure." "With respect, sir, standard procedure would have these cubs dead before the paperwork cleared," Ryan replied, not taking his eyes off Sarah's work. Stevens sighed heavily. "You've got 1 hour before I need this space back and these animals transferred to proper authorities." After Stevens left, Sarah looked up at Ryan. "1 hour isn't enough. The smallest one might not make it even with optimal care." "Then we'll make do," Ryan said with quiet determination. "What do you need?" As the evening deepened outside the windowless room, Ryan and Sarah worked in tandem to stabilize the 3 cubs. The 2 larger ones, both males, began responding to treatment, their breathing strengthening as fluids and nutrients entered their systems. The little female remained critical. "I don't understand why Duke is acting this way," Sarah said during a brief pause in their work. The German shepherd had refused to leave the room, positioning himself as close to the cubs as Ryan would allow, his attention unwavering. Ryan hesitated, then decided to share something he rarely spoke about. "My wife, Emily, before she died, she worked with big cats, conservation projects, mostly. Duke was originally her dog. She started his training." Sarah's hand stilled for a moment. "I didn't know." "Not something I talk about much." Ryan checked the smallest cub's IV line. Emily had this theory about scent imprinting in canines. She was working on training dogs to detect specific wildlife for conservation tracking. Duke was her first success. "That might explain his reaction," Sarah mused. "He's scent imprinted to recognize big cats." Around midnight, with the cubs somewhat stabilized, Ryan received word that arrangements had been made to transfer them to Sarah's Wildlife Rehabilitation Center in northern Westchester County. It wasn't protocol, but Captain Stevens had pulled strings, sensing something important in Ryan's uncharacteristic insistence. As they prepared for transport, Sarah made a discovery that changed everything. "Ryan," she called, her voice tight. "Look at this." She had been examining the cubs more thoroughly now that they were stable enough to handle. Parting the fur at the nape of the smallest cub's neck, she revealed a tiny, nearly invisible scar. "What is that?" Ryan leaned closer. "Some kind of microchip, not standard conservation tracking." Sarah's expression was grim. "I've seen this before in high-value trafficked animals. It's how the buyers track their investment." Ryan felt a cold anger settle in his bones. "Can you remove it?" "Yes, but—" Sarah hesitated. "These aren't just any tigers, Ryan. The markings, the coloration, these are hybrid Siberian Bengals, extremely rare, worth millions on the black market." As if understanding the gravity of Sarah's words, Duke suddenly became agitated, moving to stand directly over the smallest cub. A low growl rumbling in his chest. "Duke, heel," Ryan commanded. But for the second time that day, his perfectly trained partner ignored him. The shepherd remained planted over the cub, his posture protective rather than threatening. "I've never seen anything like this," Sarah whispered, watching in amazement. "It's like he's guarding her." Ryan knelt beside Duke, placing a hand on his back. "Easy, boy. No one's going to hurt her." In that moment, looking into Duke's intent eyes, Ryan felt a connection to Emily so strong it nearly took his breath away. This was her work, her passion living on through the dog she'd trained. "He stays with them," Ryan decided. "Whatever happens, Duke remains with the cubs." By dawn, they had successfully transported the cubs to Sarah's Rehabilitation Center, a converted barn on 20 acres of wooded land. Ryan had taken emergency personal leave, calling in a favor from Stevens. 3 days, Mitchell," his captain had warned. "Then I need you back on duty or filling out retirement papers." Sarah's facility was a testament to her dedication to state-of-the-art medical equipment alongside natural enrichment areas for recovering animals. The smallest cub had survived the night, though Sarah remained cautious about her prognosis. "These cubs are maybe 8 weeks old," Sarah explained as they settled them into a climate-controlled recovery space. "They should still be with their mother, learning to hunt, developing crucial social behaviors." Ryan watched through the observation window as Duke curled his body around the 3 cubs in their bed of blankets, the shepherd's vigilance unwavering. "He's not going to leave them, is he?" Sarah shook her head, a small smile touching her lips. Emily's training runs deep. As the morning progressed, Sarah continued her examination of the cubs, making notes and taking samples. When Ryan returned from a brief coffee run, he found her frowning at her computer screen. "What is it?" "These microchips," Sarah said, gesturing to the tiny devices she'd carefully removed from each cub. "They're sophisticated GPS tracking, temperature monitoring. Someone invested serious technology in these animals. Can they tell us where they came from?" "Better than that," Sarah replied, turning the screen toward him. "I've accessed the data. These cubs have been tracked from birth, which was—" She paused, checking the information. "A private facility just outside Kiev. But here's the strange part. The data shows they were sold to an American buyer." "Who?" Ryan felt his investigative instincts snap to attention. "The chip only shows a client number, but—" Sarah was interrupted by the facility's security alarm. She jumped up, moving quickly to the monitoring system. "Someone's trying to access the rear entrance." Ryan's hand instinctively went to where his service weapon would normally be. "Call security. I'll check it out." "Ryan, wait," Sarah began. But he was already moving toward the back of the facility, Duke reluctantly following after a command from his master. As Ryan approached the rear loading area, he heard the sound of a vehicle quickly departing. The door showed signs of attempted forced entry, but whoever had been there was gone. A single piece of paper had been pushed partially under the door. Ryan carefully retrieved it wearing gloves. A single sentence was typed in the center. "Return what belongs to us, or the next visit won't be a warning." Ryan called in the threat immediately, his years of training taking over despite his fatigue. Local police arrived first, followed shortly by Detective Jack Harrison from the Wildlife Trafficking Task Force, a barrel-chested man with shrewd eyes and a methodical approach that had earned him the department nickname Steady Jack. "So they came right to your doorstep," Harrison mused, examining the note in an evidence bag. "That tells us two things: they've got resources to track these animals quickly, and they're not afraid of law enforcement." Sarah stood in the doorway, arms crossed tightly over her chest. "The cubs are too fragile to be moved again. The smallest one barely survived the night." Harrison nodded, his expression softening slightly. "We'll post officers here until we get a better handle on the threat level. In the meantime, I need everything you've got on these animals." Inside Sarah's office, they spread out what little information they had: the baggage routing tags, the microchips Sarah had removed, photographs of the cubs' condition upon discovery. Duke had returned to the cubs, refusing to leave their side even when Ryan called him. "The airport surveillance might give us something," Harrison suggested. "I'll have my team pull footage of whoever checked that suitcase in Kiev." Ryan rubbed his face, the stubble of 24 hours without shaving rough against his palm. "They won't be amateurs. They'll have used a proxy, someone disposable." "Maybe," Harrison conceded, "but sometimes we get lucky." By mid-afternoon, the two larger cubs were showing improvement, taking small amounts of formula from bottles Sarah had prepared with a mixture she'd developed specifically for big cat rehabilitation. The smallest female still required tube feeding, her recovery more tenuous. Ryan found himself drawn to the observation room, watching Sarah work. Her hands moved with gentle precision as she checked vital signs, adjusted medications, and spoke in soothing tones to the cubs. It reminded him of Emily, the same focused compassion, the same reverence for the wild creatures under her care. "She has a fighting spirit," Sarah remarked when she noticed Ryan watching. The little one. Most cubs in her condition wouldn't have made it this far. What are her chances? Ryan asked. Sarah's expression was carefully neutral. Better today than yesterday. Ask me again tomorrow. Ryan nodded, understanding the cautious optimism of someone who'd seen many animals lost despite her best efforts. They need names, he said suddenly. We can't just keep calling them the cubs. A smile touched Sarah's lips. Any suggestions? Ryan studied the 3 tigers, the 2 stronger males with their bold markings, and the tiny female whose dark stripes seemed almost too large for her small body. Ranger and Scout for the boys, he decided, then paused, looking at the smallest cub. And Ember for the little fighter? Ember, Sarah repeated softly. I like that. As Sarah continued her work, Ryan stepped outside to call Captain Stevens, updating him on the situation. The conversation was brief and to the point. Ryan's leave was approved for a full week, but Stevens made it clear that this was stretching departmental flexibility to its limits. There's something else, Stevens added before hanging up. Someone's been asking questions about the interception. Someone with connections. What kind of connections? Ryan felt his muscles tense. Political? High up. Stevens's voice lowered. Be careful, Mitchell. This might be bigger than a simple smuggling case. When Ryan returned to the recovery room, he found Harrison reviewing footage on his tablet. Got something, the detective said without preamble. The suitcase was checked in by a woman traveling on a Bulgarian passport. Facial recognition says the passport's a fake. Ryan leaned over to look at the grainy airport security image. Professional job. Very. She handed off the suitcase and immediately left the airport without boarding. Never went through security. Harrison swiped to another image. But here's where it gets interesting. The manifest shows the suitcase was transferred to this man in Istanbul. The second image showed a well-dressed businessman, his face partially obscured by sunglasses despite the indoor setting. Something about his posture triggered a vague sense of recognition in Ryan. Run that through the system, Ryan suggested. There's something familiar about him. While Harrison's team worked on identifying the courier, Ryan and Sarah established a round-the-clock monitoring schedule for the cubs. The rehabilitation center's small staff had been sent home as a precaution, leaving just the 3 of them plus 2 local police officers posted outside. That evening, as Sarah prepared another round of medications, Ryan found himself studying the cubs with growing curiosity. The markings are unusual, he observed. Even for tigers. Sarah nodded without looking up from her work. Tiger subspecies each have distinctive stripe patterns. These hybrids show characteristics of both Siberian and Bengal tigers, which makes them extremely valuable to collectors who want something unique. The disgust in her voice was evident. How would someone even create such a hybrid? Ryan asked. It's not like these subspecies naturally encounter each other in the wild. Private breeding operations, Sarah replied grimly. Usually under terrible conditions. The mother is often kept constantly pregnant until her body gives out. For every cub that survives, many don't. Ryan felt a cold anger building in his chest, the same righteous fury he'd experienced years ago in Afghanistan when they'd discovered the warlord's menagerie of suffering exotic animals. He remembered Emily's tears when he'd described the conditions to her, how she'd channeled her heartbreak into more determined conservation work. I've seen it before, he said quietly. In Afghanistan, We raided a compound where a local warlord kept exotic animals as status symbols. There was a tiger cub chained in the courtyard. Sarah's hands stilled. What happened to it? I tried to save it, carried it for miles to our extraction point. It died before we reached base. Ryan's voice grew distant with the memory. Emily was devastated when I told her. She'd been working with tigers in a conservation program at the time. A small sound from the recovery area drew their attention. Duke had risen from his position beside the cubs, standing alert with his ears forward. Through the observation window, they watched as Ember, the smallest cub, struggled to lift her head for the first time since her rescue. "Look at that," Sarah whispered, a smile breaking across her tired face. "She's trying." The moment felt significant, a tiny victory against overwhelming odds. Ryan found himself holding his breath as the small tiger cub wobbled, determined to raise herself up. Duke moved closer, lying down with his body positioned to support her small frame. The moment was interrupted by Harrison's return. "We've got an ID on our Istanbul courier," he announced, holding up his phone. "Samuel Turner, American businessman, works as a logistics consultant for several high-end clients." "Criminal record?" Ryan asked. "Clean as a whistle," Harrison replied. "But his travel patterns are interesting. Multiple trips to countries known for wildlife trafficking: Vietnam, Thailand, United Arab Emirates, Ukraine. A professional smuggler with good cover," Ryan concluded. Harrison nodded. "And expensive taste. His last employer of record is the Westfield Conservation Group." Ryan felt his stomach drop. "Charles Westfield, the philanthropist?" "The very same. Your airports had him speak at several charity events, if I recall." Harrison studied Ryan's reaction carefully. "You know him?" Ryan's mind raced through the connections. Charles Westfield was a household name in conservation circles, a billionaire who had donated millions to wildlife preserves and anti-poaching initiatives. His foundation ran television commercials featuring Westfield himself in the field with endangered species, advocating for their protection. Ryan had met him briefly at a fundraiser Emily had dragged him to years ago. "I know of him," Ryan said carefully. "Everyone in law enforcement does. His foundation funds half the K-9 training programs on the East Coast, including yours." Harrison's question was pointed. Ryan nodded, the implications settling like a weight on his shoulders. "Including ours." Sarah, who had been listening intently, broke her silence. "That can't be a coincidence. A major conservation figure connected to tiger trafficking." "It's a perfect cover," Harrison said grimly. "Who would suspect the man publicly fighting to save these animals?" The revelation cast their situation in a new, more dangerous light. If Charles Westfield was somehow involved, they were facing an adversary with nearly unlimited resources and powerful connections throughout law enforcement and politics. That night, while Sarah caught a few hours of sleep, Ryan sat with the cubs and Duke. The German shepherd had barely left their side, maintaining his self-appointed guardianship with unwavering dedication. Ranger and Scout had graduated to lapping formula from a shallow dish, their strength visibly returning. Ember remained weaker but continued fighting, her determination evident in every small movement. Ryan's phone buzzed with a text from Harrison. "Background on Turner shows 5 trips to Afghanistan between 2010 to 2013. Military contractor." Ooh. The timing aligned perfectly with Ryan's deployment, the period when he had found the tiger cub at the warlord's compound. He stared at his phone. Pieces of a puzzle he hadn't known existed beginning to take shape in his mind. By morning, Ember showed remarkable improvement, her eyes more alert, her breathing stronger. Sarah was cautiously optimistic as she performed her examination. "Her fight isn't over," she warned Ryan, "but she's headed in the right direction." Ryan watched the small tiger with growing attachment. There was something about her spirit that resonated with him, a refusal to surrender, despite overwhelming odds. Duke's behavior toward Ember remained particularly attentive. The shepherd would gently nudge her when she seemed to be struggling, positioning himself so she could lean against him when attempting to sit up. "I've never seen anything like it," Sarah remarked, observing their interaction. "It's almost like he recognizes something in her." Later that day, as Sarah was changing the bedding in the cub's enclosure, she made a discovery that sent a chill through both of them. "Ryan," she called, her voice tight with concern. "Come look at this." On Ember's hind leg, previously hidden by the blankets and her position, was a distinctive marking, not a natural tiger stripe, but what appeared to be a deliberate scarification in the pattern of a small crescent. "Is that—" Ryan began. "Man-made," Sarah confirmed grimly. "Some kind of branding or identification mark." Ryan stared at the marking, a memory surfacing from the recesses of his mind. The tiger cub in Afghanistan had borne a similar mark on its leg. He had assumed it was an injury from the chains. "I've seen this before," he said quietly. The cub in Afghanistan had the same mark. Sarah's eyes widened. "That can't be coincidence." "No," Ryan agreed. "It's a signature. Someone's claiming ownership." Harrison arrived an hour later, bringing with him enlarged images from the Kiev and Istanbul airports. They gathered in Sarah's office to review the new evidence. "Turner isn't just a courier," Harrison explained, pointing to a series of photos showing the man meeting with various individuals in airports around the world. "He's a broker. He connects buyers with sellers, handles the logistics of transport, ensures delivery, and his connection to Westfield," Ryan pressed. Harrison's expression was grim. "On paper, Turner's company provides exotic specimen acquisition for Westfield's private conservation breeding programs. In reality, I think he's sourcing animals for private collectors using Westfield's legitimate conservation work as cover." "So Westfield might not be involved?" Sarah asked hopefully. "Or he's the mastermind," Harrison countered. "Either way, we need to find out." Ryan's phone rang, Captain Stevens calling for an update. He stepped outside to take the call, the spring air cool against his face after the stuffiness of the office. "Mitchell, you've stepped in something big here." Stevens began without preamble. "I just got a call from the commissioner's office asking about the tiger cubs. They're claiming they should be transferred to Westfield's conservation facility upstate." Ryan's grip tightened on the phone. "On whose authority?" "Fish and Wildlife, supposedly. But the request came through channels I've never seen used for something like this." Stevens paused. "What exactly are you involved in?" Ryan explained their suspicions about Turner and the possible connection to Westfield, careful not to directly accuse the philanthropist without concrete evidence. "Christ," Stevens muttered. "Westfield donated the funds for our new K-9 training center last year. The commissioner played golf with him last weekend. I need more time," Ryan insisted. "At least until we can confirm whether Westfield is involved." A long silence followed. 48 hours. Stevens finally said, "That's all I can buy you. After that, this goes by the book wherever that leads." When Ryan returned to the office, Sarah and Harrison were reviewing documentation on tiger cubs seized in similar smuggling operations over the past 5 years. "There's a pattern," Sarah was saying, pointing to images on her computer screen. Similar markings, similar transport methods, always high-value hybrids, always with these microchips. Harrison nodded. And look at the destinations, all wealthy areas with lax exotic pet enforcement. The Hamptons, Palm Beach, Silicon Valley. Status symbols, Ryan concluded, rejoining them. Like the warlord's menagerie. Exactly, Sarah agreed. The ultimate display of wealth and power, owning an animal no one else has. As evening approached, they established a security rotation, with Harrison taking the first watch outside while Ryan and Sarah continued monitoring the cubs. Duke remained steadfast in his vigil, leaving the cubs only for brief, necessary breaks. Sarah prepared the evening medications and feedings, her movements efficient despite her exhaustion. Ryan found himself admiring her dedication, the same quality that had drawn him to Emily years ago. "You know," Sarah said as they worked side by side, "when I first heard about you from the other officers, they called you the silent type. Said you barely spoke 3 words unless it was about work." Ryan raised an eyebrow. And I've never seen you stop talking around these cubs," she said with a small smile. "It's like they've unlocked something in you." Ryan hadn't realized it himself, but she was right. Something about this case, these animals, had breached the walls he'd carefully built after Emily's death. "Emily used to say that animals can sense what we need better than we can ourselves," he replied after a moment. "Maybe Duke knew I needed this, to care about something again." Their conversation was interrupted by an alert from the security system, motion detected at the property's perimeter. Harrison radioed in from his position. "Vehicle approaching, lights off. Taking cover to observe." Ryan moved quickly to the security monitors while Sarah dimmed the lights in the recovery area. The grainy night vision cameras showed a black SUV stopping just outside the property line. 2 figures emerged, moving with practiced stealth toward the building. "Call it in," Ryan told Sarah, already moving toward the rear exit where he had stashed the service weapon that, technically, he shouldn't have brought while on leave. "Be careful," Sarah urged. Reaching for the phone, outside, the spring night was cool and clear, a quarter moon providing just enough light to cast shadows among the trees surrounding the rehabilitation center. Ryan moved silently, years of military training guiding his steps as he circled around to approach the intruders from behind. He spotted Harrison in position behind a maintenance shed, weapon drawn. The detective acknowledged Ryan with a subtle nod, then gestured toward the 2 figures now crouching near the building's electrical panel. They were professionals moving with purpose, communicating with hand signals, carrying what appeared to be specialized tools for bypassing security systems. Ryan recognized the tactics from his own training. Just as the intruders began working on the electrical panel, headlights suddenly swept the area, a police cruiser responding to Sarah's call. The 2 figures immediately abandoned their task, sprinting back toward their vehicle. "Police freeze!" Harrison shouted, breaking cover. The intruders didn't hesitate, diving into their SUV and accelerating away, tires spitting gravel. Harrison fired a shot at their tires but missed in the darkness. The police cruiser gave chase. But Ryan suspected the officers would find the SUV abandoned within miles. Professionals never kept a compromised vehicle. "They'll be back," Harrison said grimly as they returned to the building. "And next time they'll come better prepared." The attempted break-in changed everything. Harrison called in additional resources, 2 more officers for perimeter security, and an evidence team to process what little the intruders had left behind. By morning, They had established that the SUV had indeed been abandoned 10 miles away, wiped clean of prints, with license plates that had been stolen from a vehicle in a long-term airport parking lot. "Professional job," Harrison concluded, staring at the photographs of the abandoned vehicle. "These aren't just wildlife traffickers. They've got paramilitary training." Ryan had suspected as much from their movements the night before. "We need to move the cubs," he said, the decision crystallizing in his mind. "This location is compromised." Sarah looked up from where she was bottle-feeding Ember, whose condition had continued to improve overnight. "Move them where they're still too fragile for transport, especially Ember." "I have a place," Ryan said. "My grandfather's cabin in the Catskills. Remote, defensible, off the grid, no digital trail to follow." Harrison considered this. "It's not protocol." "Protocol won't keep them alive," Ryan countered, a new urgency in his voice. "Whoever's after these cubs has resources, connections in law enforcement, and they know where we are. We need to disappear." After a tense debate, a plan took shape. They would create a decoy transport, an official-looking wildlife service vehicle heading west toward a known rehabilitation facility, while Ryan and Sarah would take the cubs north in her veterinary transport van, modified to provide the necessary environmental controls for the fragile tigers. By noon, everything was in place. Harrison would coordinate with trusted officers to maintain the illusion that the cubs remained at the rehabilitation center, while simultaneously providing security for the decoy transport. 48 hours, Harrison told Ryan as they loaded the last of the medical supplies into Sarah's van. "That's how long I can maintain this shell game before official questions start getting answers." Ryan nodded grimly. "By then, we'll either have proof of who's behind this or we'll be out of options." The journey to the cabin was tense, with Sarah monitoring the cubs' conditions from a specially constructed holding area in the back of the van while Ryan drove, constantly checking for signs of surveillance. Duke rode in the rear with the cubs, his protective instincts seemingly intensified since the previous night's intrusion. "Tell me about this cabin," Sarah said after they had been driving for an hour, clearly trying to distract herself from worrying about the cubs' stability during transport. "My grandfather built it after he came back from Korea," Ryan explained, eyes still scanning the road ahead and behind. "He called it his thinking place. Taught me to fish there when I was a kid. After he passed, it came to me. I haven't been much since Emily got sick." Sarah was quiet for a moment. "Emily would be proud of what you're doing now." Ryan's hands tightened on the steering wheel. "She always was better at this than me caring for things, fighting for the voiceless. I was just the muscle." "That's not what I'm seeing," Sarah replied softly. "You've put your career on the line for these cubs. That's not just muscle. That's heart." The dirt road to the cabin was nearly invisible from the main highway, marked only by a weathered fence post that Ryan's grandfather had painted with a small blue stripe, a family marker that meant nothing to strangers. The cabin itself sat nestled among towering pines, its weathered cedar siding blending into the surrounding forest. "It's perfect," Sarah breathed as the cabin came into view. "Completely hidden." Ryan allowed himself a small smile. "Grandpa was a bit of a survivalist before that was even a term. Said a man should always have a place the world can't find him." Inside, the cabin was simple but solidly built, a main room with a stone fireplace, a small kitchen area, 2 bedrooms, and a surprisingly modern bathroom that Ryan had updated himself years ago. The furnishings were sparse but functional, with an old leather sofa facing the fireplace and a solid oak dining table that his grandfather had crafted by hand. "We'll set up the recovery area here," Sarah decided, pointing to a corner of the main room near the fireplace. "The heat will help maintain their temperature." As Ryan brought in the portable enclosure and medical equipment, Sarah continued monitoring the cubs, relieved to find that they had weathered the journey well. Even Ember seemed stronger, her eyes more alert and tracking movement around her. "She's a fighter," Sarah remarked, gently stroking the small cub's head. "She reminds me of some of the rescue cubs I worked with in India. The ones that survived the worst conditions often had this same look, like they've decided the world isn't going to beat them." By evening, they had established a functional recovery space for the cubs and settled into an uneasy vigilance. With the cabin secure and the cubs resting comfortably, Ryan finally had a moment to refocus on the investigation. He spread out copies of the documents Harrison had provided on the cabin's dining table. "Let's go through this step by step," he said as Sarah joined him after checking the cubs' vitals once more. "What do we know for certain?" "We know the cubs came from Ukraine," Sarah began. "We know they're valuable hybrids with some kind of identification marking. We know they're microchipped with sophisticated tracking technology." Ryan nodded, organizing the airport photos chronologically. "And we know they passed through the hands of Samuel Turner, who works for Westfield's conservation group, which gives us a connection to Charles Westfield," Sarah continued. "Though we don't know if he's directly involved or if Turner is operating independently." Ryan pulled out his phone, showing Sarah the text from Harrison about Turner's visits to Afghanistan. "What we don't know is if there's a connection between these cubs and the tiger I found in Afghanistan. The timing fits, and the marking is similar, but it could be coincidence. Or it could be the key to everything," Sarah said thoughtfully. "Have you told Harrison about the Afghanistan connection?" "Not the details." "Not yet." Ryan hesitated. "It was classified at the time the raid on the warlord's compound. I'd need clearance to share specifics." Sarah frowned. "But if it helps identify who's behind this—" "I know." Ryan's expression was troubled. "I put in a request through Stevens. We should hear something tomorrow." As night fell, they established a watch rotation, with Ryan taking the first shift while Sarah got some much-needed rest. The cabin was eerily quiet, the only sounds the occasional creak of the old timbers and the soft breathing of the cubs. Duke maintained his position beside the tiger enclosure, alert despite his own exhaustion. Ryan found himself studying Ember as she slept. The tiny cub had begun to show more personality as her strength returned a fierce determination that reminded him of Emily in her final months, fighting against the cancer that was consuming her body. "You're not giving up," he murmured to the sleeping cub. "Neither will I." Around midnight, Ryan's phone vibrated with a text from Harrison. "Decoy transport reached sanctuary. No incidents. Background on Westfield shows hefty donation to Fish and Wildlife Directors Foundation last year." Another piece of the puzzle, suggesting Westfield's influence extended into the very agencies responsible for protecting endangered species. The scope of the corruption was beginning to take shape, and it was more extensive than Ryan had initially feared. He was still pondering the implications when a sound from outside caught his attention, the faint crunch of pine needles under a careful foot. Duke's head lifted, ears forward, body tensing. Someone was approaching the cabin. Ryan moved silently to the window, staying to the side to avoid being silhouetted. In the pale moonlight, he could make out a single figure moving through the trees toward the cabin. The person moved with military precision, stopping frequently to scan the surroundings, easing his weapon from its holster. Ryan motioned for Duke to stay with the cubs. He moved to the cabin's rear door, deciding to circle behind the intruder rather than wait for them to reach the cabin. The forest floor was soft under his feet, years of fallen pine needles cushioning his steps. He moved as he had been trained, from shadow to shadow, keeping the intruder in sight while remaining concealed himself. As he drew closer, he could see the figure more clearly, a man in dark, tactical clothing, carrying what appeared to be a rifle with a scope. Not a common poacher, but a professional hunter. Ryan closed the distance carefully, waiting for the perfect moment when the man paused to survey the cabin. In one fluid motion, he emerged from cover, his weapon trained on the intruder's back. "Federal agent," Ryan said quietly. "Drop the weapon." Slowly. The man froze, then carefully lowered his rifle to the ground. "I'm not who you think I am," he said, his voice oddly familiar. "Turn around. Hands where I can see them." As the figure turned, Ryan felt a jolt of recognition. The face staring back at him belonged to Jack Harrison. "What the hell are you doing here?" Ryan demanded, not lowering his weapon. "You're supposed to be coordinating the decoy operation." "I handed that off," Harrison replied calmly. "When I found out who we're really dealing with, I knew you'd need backup, real backup." Ryan kept his weapon steady. "How did you find this place?" "I put a tracker on your phone at the rehabilitation center," Harrison admitted. "Standard procedure when dealing with high-value evidence. I didn't know if I could fully trust you yet." The admission stung, but Ryan understood the logic. "And now I know we're on the same side," Harrison said grimly. "But we're up against something bigger than either of us anticipated." Inside the cabin, Harrison laid out what he'd discovered in the hours since they'd separated. The connections reached further and higher than they had imagined, with evidence suggesting a trafficking network that spanned continents and involved officials at the highest levels. "Westfield isn't just connected to this operation," Harrison explained, spreading photographs across the table. "I think he runs it. His conservation work gives him access to endangered species around the world, perfect cover for identifying valuable specimens and arranging their theft or illegal breeding." Sarah, who had awakened at the commotion, joined them at the table. "But why take such risks? He's already wealthy, already respected." "Power," Ryan suggested, the pieces falling into place in his mind. "The kind money can't buy. Controlling the fate of entire species." Harrison nodded. "We found communications on Turner's seized devices. Westfield doesn't just sell these animals he controls. Who gets them? Dictators, oligarchs, tech billionaires, they all come to him. It's not just commerce, it's influence." "And the cubs?" Sarah asked, glancing toward the enclosure where the 3 tigers were now awake, watching the humans with curious eyes. "Special order," Harrison said grimly. "Bred specifically for a buyer who requested certain traits. The markings, the hybrid lineage, all custom designed." Ryan's mind flashed back to Afghanistan, to the tiger cub with the crescent mark. "There's more to it," he said quietly. "The marking on Ember's leg, I've seen it before. On a tiger cub in Afghanistan." Harrison's expression sharpened. "When exactly?" 8 years ago. Special operations raid on a warlord's compound near the Pakistan border." Ryan hesitated, then decided to share the full story. The warlord was using his compound as a way station for all kinds of trafficking weapons, drugs, people. We found a menagerie of exotic animals, including a tiger cub chained in the courtyard. It had the same crescent marking. "Did you get the warlord?" Harrison asked. Ryan shook his head. "He escaped during the raid. We freed the prisoners, seized the weapons, but he slipped away. The cub died during our exfiltration. I buried it at our forward operating base." Harrison was already typing on his phone. "What was the warlord's name?" "We knew him as Aziz al-Farsi," Ryan replied, though intelligence suggested that wasn't his real name. Harrison showed Ryan and Sarah his phone screen, displaying a photograph taken at a conservation gala 2 years earlier. In it, Charles Westfield stood smiling beside a Middle Eastern man in an expensive suit. "Recognize him?" Ryan felt his blood run cold. The man beside Westfield was older, more polished, but unmistakably the warlord from Afghanistan. "That's impossible. He was on every watch list." "Not impossible if you have the right connections," Harrison countered. "Westfield's foundation has donated millions to counter-terrorism initiatives. He has access to intelligence, to officials who could make problems disappear." Sarah looked between them, comprehension dawning on her face. "Are you saying Westfield helped this warlord escape prosecution by giving him a new identity? And in exchange, the warlord provided access to rare animals from regions too dangerous for normal collection?" Harrison confirmed. "It's a partnership. Westfield provides legitimacy, connections to move freely between countries. The warlord, whatever his real name is, provides expertise in moving contraband across borders." Ryan stared at the photo, memories of Afghanistan flooding back the brutality they had discovered at the compound, the suffering of both human and animal prisoners. Then these cubs might be descendants of the tiger you tried to save, Harrison finished. Part of a breeding program that's been operating for years. The realization landed like a physical blow. Ryan had carried the guilt of failing to save that tiger cub for years. To discover that its suffering had been merely one small part of a global criminal enterprise orchestrated by an American philanthropist was almost too much to process. "We need to move," Ryan decided, his voice hardening with resolve. "If Westfield realizes we've made these connections, we won't be safe here for long." Harrison nodded. "I've arranged secure transport to a federal holding facility upstate. We can move at first light." "And then what?" Sarah asked, gently stroking Ember's head through the enclosure bars. "What happens to the cubs?" "They're evidence in what's shaping up to be one of the largest wildlife trafficking cases in history," Harrison replied. "But they're also endangered animals that need specialized care." He looked at Sarah. "I was hoping you might have suggestions." Before Sarah could respond, Duke suddenly stood at attention, a low growl building in his throat. All three humans froze, listening intently. In the distance, barely audible, came the sound of helicopter rotors. "We've been compromised," Harrison said, already moving toward his equipment bag. "We need to move. Now." The distant thrum of helicopter blades sliced through the night's stillness, growing steadily louder as it approached the cabin. Ryan's training kicked in instantly. Assess, decide, act. "Sarah, grab the medical kit and only what the cubs absolutely need," he instructed, his voice calm despite the urgency. "Harrison, is your vehicle nearby?" Harrison nodded. "Half a mile south, hidden off the service road, four-wheel drive SUV, fully fueled." "We'll head there through the woods," Ryan decided. already moving to secure the small tiger enclosure for transport. The forest canopy will provide some cover from air surveillance. Sarah worked with practiced efficiency, packing essential medications and supplies into a backpack. Her hands moved steadily, but Ryan could see the fear in her eyes, not for herself, but for her charges, for her Ember, still the weakest of the three cubs, watched her with wide, golden eyes that seemed to understand the gravity of their situation. "They can't track us through the microchips," Sarah confirmed, answering Ryan's unspoken question. "I removed them all and left them at the rehabilitation center." Outside, the helicopter sound grew louder, then seemed to circle, as if searching. They had minutes at most. "Ready?" Sarah announced, slipping the backpack over her shoulders. Ryan and Harrison each took an end of the portable enclosure, now secured for movement with the three cubs inside. Duke stuck close to Sarah's side, his body tense with alertness. They slipped out the rear door of the cabin and immediately into the sheltering darkness of the pine forest. Ryan led them along a barely visible trail his grandfather had shown him decades ago, a hunter's path that followed natural contours and avoided open spaces. The helicopter's searchlight swept through the trees behind them, illuminating the cabin they had just vacated. Voices carried on the night air commands being shouted as a team breached the building. "Move faster," Harrison urged quietly. "They'll realize we're gone within seconds." The path sloped downward, making their progress with the enclosure more difficult. The cubs remained remarkably quiet, as if sensing the need for silence. Only once did Scout let out a small mewl when they navigated a particularly bumpy section, causing all three humans to freeze momentarily. "Almost there," Harrison whispered, after what seemed like an eternity of careful movement through the darkness. Ahead, Ryan could just make out the outline of a black SUV tucked beneath a stand of hemlocks. They had nearly reached the vehicle when Duke suddenly stiffened, a low growl rumbling in his chest. Ryan raised his hand, signaling for a halt. In the stillness, they heard it the snap of a twig, perhaps 50 yards to their right. "They've deployed ground units," Harrison breathed, barely audible. "They must have thermal imaging." Ryan made a split-second decision. "Sarah, take Duke and the cubs with Harrison. I'll create a diversion." "Ryan, no," Sarah began, but he cut her off. "It's the only way to get the cubs out safely." His tone left no room for argument. "I know these woods. I'll meet you at the rendezvous point." Harrison nodded grimly, understanding the tactical necessity. He passed Ryan an extra magazine for his weapon and a small radio. "Channel 3, encrypted. We'll wait for you as long as we can." Ryan knelt briefly beside the enclosure, looking at the three small tigers that had somehow become so important to him in such a short time. Ember's eyes met his, and he felt an inexplicable connection, a shared resilience. "Keep fighting," he whispered to her. Then he turned to Duke, placing a hand on the shepherd's head. "Protect them," he commanded softly. Duke's eyes, intelligent and solemn, seemed to understand. With a final nod to Sarah and Harrison, Ryan moved silently into the forest, deliberately heading in the opposite direction from the SUV. Once he had put about 100 yards between himself and the others, he made his move crashing through underbrush with deliberate noise, snapping branches and rustling leaves. The reaction was immediate. Shouts echoed through the trees, and beams of tactical flashlights swung in his direction. Ryan ran, using the terrain to his advantage, leading the pursuit team away from his companions. Behind him, he heard the faint sound of the SUV's engine starting, then fading as Harrison drove away with Sarah and the cubs. Relief flooded through him. They had at least a chance now. For nearly 20 minutes, Ryan led his pursuers on a chase through the forest, using every trick he had learned in both military and law enforcement training. He doubled back, crossed a shallow stream to mask his scent, and used the natural terrain to create confusion. Eventually, he found what he was looking for, a rocky outcropping that overlooked a small clearing. He positioned himself there, concealed but with good visibility, and waited. Within minutes, 4 men in tactical gear emerged into the clearing, their movements betraying professional training. In the moonlight, Ryan could make out their equipment, high-end gear, not standard law enforcement issue. These were private contractors, likely ex-military, the kind of men who asked few questions when the money was right. Their leader, a tall man with a close-cropped beard, raised a hand to halt his team. "He's toying with us," the man said, his voice carrying in the night air. "Spread out, 5-meter intervals. He can't evade us forever." As the team began to disperse, Ryan made his move. He waited until the nearest man passed directly beneath his position, then dropped down behind him, subduing him with a swift chokehold. The man struggled briefly, then went limp, then went. Before the others could react to their companion's disappearance, Ryan had melted back into the forest. Heading toward the rendezvous point Harrison had indicated, an abandoned fire tower 5 miles north. The journey was arduous, forcing Ryan to navigate unfamiliar terrain while constantly watching for signs of pursuit. Twice he had to conceal himself as helicopter sweeps passed overhead, their searchlights cutting through the canopy. By the time he reached the fire tower, dawn was breaking over the Catskills, painting the sky in streaks of pink and gold. The tower itself stood like a sentinel in a small clearing, its metal frame weathered by decades of exposure. Ryan approached cautiously, scanning for any sign of Harrison's SUV or potential threats. The clearing appeared empty, no vehicle in sight. Had they been unable to wait captured, or had they simply never made it this far? A soft whine from the base of the tower answered his question. Duke emerged from beneath the structure, his tail wagging with relief at Ryan's appearance. "Good boy," Ryan whispered, kneeling to greet the shepherd. "Where are they?" Duke led him to a concealed trapdoor, part of the tower's original design, used for storage by the fire watchers who had once manned the station. Below, in the small underground space, Ryan found Sarah tending to the cubs while Harrison kept watch through a small observation port. "You made it." Sarah's relief was palpable as she embraced Ryan briefly. "We were beginning to worry. Had to take the scenic route," Ryan replied with a grim smile. "What's the situation?" Harrison's expression was grave. "Not good. They've got roadblocks on every access point out of these mountains. State police, Forest Service, even some federal agencies I can't identify. Westfield's pulled out all the stops." "How is that possible?" Ryan asked. "How can one man command that kind of response?" "He's leveraging legitimate wildlife trafficking concerns," Harrison explained. "The official story is that dangerous predators have been stolen by eco-terrorists. Every law enforcement agency in the region is looking for us." The reality of their situation settled like a weight on Ryan's shoulders. They were trapped, outnumbered, with limited supplies and 3 endangered tiger cubs that required specialized care. "Ember's not doing well," Sarah said quietly. drawing Ryan's attention to the smallest cub. The stress of the move, the cold night, she's regressing. Ryan knelt beside the enclosure, his heart sinking as he observed Ember's condition. The small tiger's breathing was labored, her eyes dull compared to the previous day. She had fought so hard, shown such spirit, and now— "What does she need?" Ryan asked, a desperate edge to his voice. "Stability, proper medical equipment, warmth." Sarah's frustration was evident. "Things we don't have in an abandoned fire tower." Harrison, who had been monitoring radio communications through a small receiver, cursed softly. "They're expanding the search grid. We've got maybe 3 hours before they reach this area." Ryan felt a familiar sensation settling in his chest, the same hollowness he had experienced in Afghanistan, watching the tiger cub die in his arms. The same helplessness that had engulfed him during Emily's final days. He was failing again, watching another life slip away despite his best efforts. "There has to be something we can do," he insisted, looking between Sarah and Harrison. "Some way to get these cubs to safety." "There might be," Harrison said slowly, a thoughtful expression crossing his face. "But it's risky, and it means revealing our location." "What are you thinking?" Sarah asked. "Captain Stevens," Harrison explained. "Ryan's supervisor. He's been trying to contact you. Mitchell. Says he has important information about the Westfield operation." Ryan frowned. "Stevens is a good man, but this goes beyond one police captain. Westfield has federal agencies in his pocket. Stevens says he's assembled evidence of corruption within Fish and Wildlife, going back years. Documents linking Westfield to illegal breeding operations in 3 countries. Harrison held up his phone. "He wants to help." It was a gamble, possibly their only remaining option, but one that could lead directly to their capture if Stevens wasn't being truthful or if his communications were compromised. Before Ryan could respond, a soft sound from the enclosure drew everyone's attention. Ember had managed to lift her head, her golden eyes finding Ryan's with that same determined expression he had come to recognize. Despite her weakness, she was still fighting. "Make the call," Ryan decided. But we set the terms for the meeting, while Harrison contacted Stevens using an encrypted line. Sarah continued her efforts to stabilize Ember's condition with their limited resources. Ryan sat beside the enclosure, speaking softly to the cubs in the same tone he had once used with Duke as a puppy. "You don't give up," he told Ember, watching as her small chest rose and fell with labored breaths. "So neither will I." The call with Stevens yielded a plan risky, but with at least some chance of success. The captain would meet them at a designated location with trusted officers and proper transport for the cubs. He had documentation that could expose Westfield's operation and potentially provide them legal protection. "If this goes wrong," Sarah began as they prepared to move again. "It won't," Ryan replied with more confidence than he felt. "It can't." As Harrison and Sarah readied the cubs for transport, Ryan stepped outside to survey the surrounding forest. The morning had fully arrived now, sunlight filtering through the pine branches, birds resuming their songs as if nothing were amiss. The contrast between the beauty of the wilderness and the ugliness of what they were fighting against struck him forcefully. In Afghanistan, he had seen how greed could corrupt everything it touched, turning people into commodities, animals into status symbols, even the land itself into a resource to be exploited rather than protected. Westfield's operation was no different, just clothed in the respectability of wealth and Western sophistication. As Ryan stood contemplating their precarious situation, Duke suddenly appeared at his side, pressing against his leg in an uncharacteristic gesture of concern. The shepherd had barely left the cubs since their discovery, his protective instincts fully engaged with the vulnerable tigers. That he would leave them now to check on Ryan spoke volumes. "I'm okay, boy," Ryan assured him, kneeling to ruffle the dog's ears. "We'll get them somewhere safe. I promise." Inside, Sarah called urgently for Ryan. He rushed back, fearing the worst, only to find her bent over Ember with an expression of surprise. "Look," she said, pointing to the small cub. Ember had managed to stand, wobbling on unsteady legs but upright nonetheless. Despite her weakened state, her eyes burned with fierce determination. "Would you look at that?" Ryan breathed, a smile breaking across his face. "Tough as nails, just like someone else I knew." For a brief moment, hope flickered in the underground shelter, a small victory against overwhelming odds. But reality intruded almost immediately, as Harrison's radio crackled with an urgent message from Stevens. "We've got a problem," Harrison announced after listening to the transmission. "Westfield knows about the meeting. They've got someone inside Stevens' department." The flicker of hope extinguished as quickly as it had appeared. They were running out of options, and Ember was running out of time. Silence fell over the underground shelter as the three humans absorbed the implications of Stevens' warning. They were trapped between Westfield's forces and a meeting point that was now compromised. With each passing hour, Ember's condition would deteriorate further without proper medical care. "We need a new plan," Ryan said finally, breaking the heavy silence. "One that Westfield won't anticipate." Harrison checked his weapon, a habit born of years in high-pressure situations. "Stevens is still on our side. He suggested an alternate location, his family's hunting cabin near Montauk Point. It's off any official records, inherited through his wife's family." "Can we trust that information?" Sarah asked, gently stroking Ember's head as the cub had settled back down. Her brief show of strength exhausted. "We don't have much choice," Ryan admitted, "but we'll approach carefully. Say, the journey to Montauk would be perilous, nearly 100 miles through territory now swarming with law enforcement looking for them. They would need to avoid main roads, checkpoints, and the helicopter patrols that continued to sweep the region as they prepared to leave the temporary shelter." Ryan's phone vibrated with an incoming message. The number was unfamiliar, but the content froze his blood. "I know what you're carrying. Did you really think you could steal from me? Return what's mine, and you might live?" It was followed by a photograph that appeared to have been taken at the rehabilitation center Ryan and Sarah with the cubs just days earlier. "Westfield," Ryan said grimly, showing the message to the others. "He's making this personal." Harrison's expression darkened. "That confirms he's directly involved, not just Turner operating under his organization." Why would he risk exposing himself like this? Sarah wondered, securing the medical supplies in her backpack. He has everything to lose, because it's not about the money for him, Ryan realized, the pieces finally falling into place in his mind. These cubs represent something more: control, power, a legacy. He spent years building this operation, positioning himself as a conservation hero while running a trafficking ring right under everyone's noses. Too much ego to let anyone challenge that. Harrison agreed, especially not a K-9 officer and a wildlife vet. They moved out at midday, using the increasing cloud cover to their advantage. Harrison's SUV was hidden nearly a mile from the fire tower, requiring a careful trek through the forest with the cubs. Ranger and Scout had grown stronger, alert and responsive, but Ember remained worryingly lethargic despite her brief show of spirit earlier. The drive toward Montauk was tense, with Harrison navigating back roads and Forest Service routes to avoid detection. Sarah continued monitoring the cubs in the rear of the vehicle, administering what medication she could with their limited supplies. Duke remained vigilant, his body positioned protectively near Ember, occasionally nudging her gently as if encouraging her to keep fighting. "There's something I don't understand," Sarah said after they had been driving for nearly an hour. "If Westfield is so powerful, why not just use his connections to legally confiscate the cubs he has the influence?" "Because of what we might discover in the process," Ryan replied, watching the forest pass outside his window. "The microchips, the markings they link these cubs to other operations, possibly to Afghanistan. If that connection becomes official record, his entire network unravels." Harrison nodded in agreement. "He needs to recover these cubs and eliminate anyone who knows about them. That's why we've seen military contractors instead of just law enforcement. This isn't about recovery, it's about cleanup." The implications settled heavily over the vehicle's occupants. They weren't just witnesses to wildlife trafficking. They were loose ends to be eliminated in a sophisticated criminal operation spanning continents. As they approached a small rural gas station, Harrison pulled over. "We need fuel, and I need to check in with Stevens on a secure line." He handed Ryan a prepaid phone. "Use this if you need to contact me. I'll be back in 15 minutes. While Harrison went to make his call from a location that couldn't be easily traced, Ryan and Sarah remained with the cubs. The gas station was deserted except for an elderly attendant who barely glanced their way. "How's Ember?" Ryan asked softly, looking at the smallest cub who lay unnaturally still in the enclosure. Sarah's expression was grave. "Not good. Her temperature's dropping, and she's showing signs of respiratory distress. She needs proper medical care. Ryan. Soon." Ryan felt the familiar weight of responsibility pressing down on him. He had failed the tiger cub in Afghanistan despite his best efforts. He had been unable to save Emily from cancer. Now Ember was slipping away before his eyes, another failure he seemed powerless to prevent. As if sensing his thoughts, Sarah placed her hand over his. "This isn't Afghanistan, Ryan. And you're not alone this time." Before he could respond, Duke suddenly raised his head, ears alert. A moment later, Harrison returned to the vehicle, his expression grim. "Stevens has been detained for questioning," he reported as he slid back into the driver's seat. "His department is conducting an internal investigation into the mishandling of evidence Westfield's doing, no doubt." "The cabin?" Ryan asked. "Still our best option. Stevens' wife knows we're coming." Harrison started the engine. "But we need to assume Westfield is watching all official channels now." They continued their journey, now even more aware of their isolation. With Stevens temporarily neutralized, they had lost their most reliable ally within law enforcement. The weight of what they carried, both the physical cubs and the evidence of Westfield's operation, felt heavier with each passing mile. As evening approached, they finally reached the outskirts of Montauk. The cabin was located on a secluded plot overlooking the Atlantic, accessible only by a narrow dirt road that wound through dense coastal forest. Harrison approached cautiously, cutting the headlights as they navigated the final stretch. The cabin appeared deserted. No lights or vehicles visible. "I'll check it out," Ryan volunteered, his hand resting instinctively on his weapon. "You stay with the cubs." "Be careful," Sarah urged as he slipped out of the SUV. Ryan approached the cabin with the caution born of military training, scanning for any signs of ambush or surveillance. The structure was simple but well-maintained, a traditional cedar-shingled Long Island fishing cabin with a broad porch facing the ocean. No lights burned inside, but that meant little in a potential trap. He circled the perimeter once, finding nothing alarming, then approached the front door. It opened before he could knock, revealing a woman in her 50s with Stephen's familiar, steady gaze. "Margaret Stevens," she introduced herself quietly. "Mark said you'd be coming. You'd better get those animals inside quickly." The cabin's interior was warm and welcoming, with a fire already crackling in a stone hearth and an area prepared for the cubs' blankets laid out near the heat source, with space for medical equipment. "I was a veterinary technician before I retired," Margaret explained as they carefully brought the cubs inside. "Mark told me what you'd need." Sarah's relief was evident as she surveyed the supplies Margaret had assembled: proper IV equipment, oxygen, warming blankets, and medications more suited to their needs than what they had been able to bring. "This might save Ember's life," she said gratefully, immediately setting to work establishing a more adequate care station for the critical cub. Margaret Stevens proved to be not only prepared but knowledgeable, assisting Sarah with professional efficiency as they worked to stabilize Ember's condition. Harrison established security protocols, checking sight lines and potential approach routes, while Ryan helped where needed, never straying far from Duke and the cubs. "Mark says you found these tigers at the airport," Margaret commented as she helped Sarah prepare an IV solution. "Says they're evidence in some big trafficking case." "That's right," Ryan confirmed, carefully avoiding specifics that might put Margaret at risk. "Well, whoever's responsible ought to be strung up," the older woman declared firmly. "Living creatures aren't souvenirs or trophies." As night fell fully over the coastal landscape, the atmosphere in the cabin stabilized into a tense vigilance. Ember had responded somewhat to the improved care, her breathing more regular, though still concerning. Ranger and Scout had been fed and were sleeping peacefully in their enclosure, seemingly adapting to each new environment with remarkable resilience. Ryan sat by the window, watching the moonlight play over the Atlantic waves visible in the distance. Harrison had gone to establish a perimeter alarm system, while Sarah and Margaret continued monitoring Ember's condition. "When I was in Afghanistan," Ryan said quietly to Sarah when Margaret stepped away briefly, "the cub I found was about Ember's size. He'd been chained to a post in the sun, no water, no shelter. When I picked him up, he didn't fight or struggle, just looked at me with these eyes that seemed too old for something so young." Sarah listened silently, recognizing the importance of this rare moment of openness from Ryan. "I carried him for miles, trying to keep him cool, giving him water from my own canteen, but by the time we reached the extraction point, he was gone." Ryan's voice remained steady, but the pain of the memory was evident. "I buried him at the base, used my combat knife to carve a little marker. Emily said it was a good thing I'd done, giving him peace at the end." "She was right," Sarah said softly. Ryan's gaze remained on the distant ocean. "When I saw that marking on Ember's leg, the same as the cub in Afghanistan, it was like the past reaching forward, giving me another chance. I couldn't save him then, but maybe—" "We'll save her," Sarah promised, placing her hand over his. "We'll save all of them." Their moment was interrupted by Harrison's urgent return. "Vehicle approaching," he reported tensely. "Killed its lights about half a mile back." Ryan was immediately alert, moving to the window. "Margaret, is there a basement or cellar? Somewhere to secure the cubs?" "Root cellar," the older woman confirmed, already moving toward a trapdoor partially hidden by a rug. "Used to store fishing gear and preserves. It's well insulated." And working quickly, they transferred the cub's enclosure and essential medical equipment into the cellar, a surprisingly spacious underground room with thick walls that had once served local fishermen as storage for their catches before the advent of refrigeration. "Stay with them," Ryan instructed Sarah. "Duke, guard." The shepherd immediately positioned himself protectively beside the cub's enclosure. Above ground, Ryan, Harrison, and Margaret prepared for whoever was approaching. The cabin's lights were extinguished, the three of them positioned strategically to observe without being seen. "Could be Westfield's men," Harrison murmured, "or legitimate law enforcement operating on his information." The vehicle, a dark SUV similar to Harrison's, came to a stop about 100 yards from the cabin. For several long moments, nothing happened. Then the driver's door opened, and a familiar figure emerged. "It's Stevens," Ryan said with surprise, recognizing his captain's distinctive silhouette in the moonlight. "Something's not right," Harrison cautioned, watching through binoculars. "He's moving wrong tense, looking back at the vehicle." As Stevens took a few steps toward the cabin, a second figure emerged from the SUV, tall, distinguished, unmistakable even in the dim light. "Westfield," Harrison confirmed grimly. "Charles Westfield, philanthropist, conservation champion, and secret wildlife trafficker," placed a hand on Stevens' shoulder in what appeared to be a friendly gesture. But Ryan, watching carefully, noticed his captain's stiff posture, the unnatural angle of his arm signs that he might be under duress. "He's forcing Stevens to lead him to us," Ryan realized, "using him as leverage." Behind Westfield, two more men exited the vehicle, professional security types with the unmistakable bulge of weapons under their jackets. "What's the play?" Harrison asked quietly. Ryan considered their options, limited as they were. "We need to separate Stevens from Westfield, find out what he knows. And if Stevens has been compromised," Harrison's question hung in the air, "then we deal with that too," Ryan answered grimly. "But first, we need to know what we're facing." The four figures approached the cabin slowly, Stevens in the lead with Westfield close behind him, flanked by his two security men. In the pale moonlight streaming through the cabin windows, Ryan could see the strain on his captain's face, a man being forced to betray colleagues against his will. "Margaret, go down to the cellar with Sarah and the cubs," Ryan instructed in a whisper. "If things go wrong, there's a path through the woods behind the cabin that leads to the neighbor's property." Stevens' wife nodded grimly, her eyes darting to the approaching men with a combination of fear and fierce protectiveness. "Be careful," she whispered, disappearing through the trapdoor. Ryan and Harrison positioned themselves strategically, Harrison covering the rear of the cabin while Ryan waited near the front door, weapon ready but concealed. They would let Stevens and Westfield enter, then attempt to separate them. A soft knock came at the door, followed by Stevens' voice, strained but steady. "Mitchell, it's Stevens. We need to talk." Ryan exchanged a glance with Harrison, who nodded slightly. Taking a deep breath, Ryan opened the door, positioning himself to block any view of the cabin's interior. "Captain," he acknowledged, his expression deliberately neutral as his gaze shifted from Stevens to Westfield. "Mr. Westfield, this is an unexpected visit." Westfield smiled, the expression not reaching his cold eyes. He was exactly as Ryan remembered him from the charity event years ago, tall, distinguished, with salt and pepper hair and the confident bearing of a man accustomed to power. Only now, knowing what he did about the man's true nature, Ryan could see the predatory assessment behind the polished exterior. "Officer Mitchell," Westfield greeted him smoothly. "Your captain has been helping me locate some stolen property, rare endangered species taken by misguided activists. I believe you may have information that could assist us." Ryan kept his expression carefully blank. "I'm just enjoying some time off at a friend's cabin. Don't know anything about stolen animals." "Ryan," Stevens interjected, his voice tight. "Mr. Westfield has federal authorization to recover these animals. They're part of a legitimate conservation breeding program." The slight emphasis Stevens placed on certain words. The tension around his eyes. Ryan had worked with the man long enough to recognize the warning. Stevens was trying to tell him something while appearing to cooperate with Westfield. "Perhaps we could discuss this inside," Westfield suggested, his tone pleasant but with an undertone of command. "These matters are rather sensitive." Ryan hesitated, then stepped aside, allowing Stevens and Westfield to enter. The two security men moved to follow, but Ryan blocked their path. "Private property," he stated flatly. "Mr. Westfield and my captain can come in. You gentlemen can wait outside." A flicker of annoyance crossed Westfield's face, but he nodded to his men, who retreated to positions flanking the door. Inside, the cabin was dim, lit only by the dying embers of the fire. Harrison remained hidden in the shadows of an adjacent room, his presence unknown to the visitors. "Let's dispense with the charade, shall we?" Westfield said, once the door closed behind them, his pleasant demeanor dropping away. "We all know you have my tigers. I want them returned immediately." "Your tigers," Ryan repeated, letting genuine confusion enter his voice. "Don't play dumb, Mitchell," Westfield snapped, his composure cracking slightly. 3 Siberian Bengal hybrid cubs intercepted at JFK. They represent years of careful breeding, millions in investment. "And they were being smuggled in a suitcase," Ryan countered, studying Westfield carefully. "Hardly legal transport for endangered species." Westfield waved a dismissive hand. "Paperwork, bureaucracy. When you're doing important conservation work, sometimes conventional channels are too slow." "Conservation work?" Ryan couldn't keep the edge from his voice. "Is that what you call it when you breed tigers for private collectors? When you mark them like cattle?" He turned to Stevens. "Captain, are you really buying this?" Stevens' eyes met Ryan's, and in that moment, understanding passed between them. "No," the older officer said quietly. "I'm not." The atmosphere in the cabin shifted instantly. Westfield's expression hardened as he recognized he had lost control of the situation. "I see," he said coldly. "That's unfortunate." "What's unfortunate?" Stevens countered, stepping away from Westfield. "Is that I trusted you for years. We all did. You used legitimate conservation work to hide a global trafficking operation." Westfield's laugh was chilling in its genuine amusement. "Hide? I built the greatest wildlife acquisition network in history, right under the noses of law enforcement and conservation agencies worldwide. Do you have any idea how many officials, rangers, and bureaucrats I have on my payroll? This little setback changes nothing." "It changes everything," Harrison announced, emerging from the shadows with his weapon trained on Westfield. Because now we have your confession." Westfield's eyes widened slightly as he realized Harrison had been recording the conversation. For a moment, the cabin was silent, except for the soft crackle of the dying fire. Then Westfield smiled, his composure returning. "An illegal recording obtained under duress won't hold up in court, and that assumes you'll make it to a courtroom." He glanced toward the door, where his security men waited outside. "My men have specific instructions if I don't emerge safely within 10 minutes. They're already contained," Harrison informed him calmly. "Local police just arrived quietly, without sirens. Your men are being arrested as we speak." For the first time, genuine alarm flashed across Westfield's aristocratic features. Ryan could almost see the calculations running behind those cold eyes, weighing options, looking for leverage, a way to regain control. "The Cubs," Westfield said finally, his voice hardening. "Where are they?" "Safe," Ryan answered simply. "Away from you." "You don't understand what you're dealing with," Westfield insisted, a note of desperation entering his voice. "Those cubs are special, unique genetics, carefully developed over generations. They're worth millions to the right buyers." "They're living creatures," Stevens countered, disgust evident in his voice. "Not merchandise." Westfield's expression shifted, his desperation giving way to cold fury. "You think small. All of you. I've built relationships with people who shape the world: dictators, oligarchs, tech billionaires. They come to me for what no one else can provide. Do you think your little evidence will matter when I have judges and senators in my pocket?" As if to punctuate his threat. A sudden commotion erupted outside shouts, then the distinctive sound of gunfire. Westfield's smile returned, triumphant. "It seems my backup has arrived," he observed smoothly. "Did you really think I'd come here with just 2 men?" Ryan exchanged alarmed glances with Harrison and Stevens. The situation had just escalated beyond their preparation. "Mitchell," Stevens said urgently, "get to the cellar. Protect the Cubs and the women. Harrison and I will handle this." Before Ryan could protest, more gunfire erupted outside, closer this time. Harrison moved to the window, peering cautiously through the curtains. At least 6 men, tactical gear, approaching from the tree line, he reported grimly. "Professional operators." Ryan hesitated, torn between staying to help fight and protecting those in the cellar. The decision was made for him when Westfield suddenly lunged for a decorative letter opener on a nearby desk, driving it toward Stevens with surprising speed. The captain deflected the blow but staggered backward, the blade slicing across his forearm. Westfield used the moment of confusion to break for the door, moving with the unexpected agility of a man who had clearly seen combat despite his polished exterior. "Go!" Harrison shouted to Ryan, already moving to intercept Westfield, while simultaneously providing cover for Stevens. "We'll hold them off." Ryan raced to the trap door, lifting it to find Sarah, Margaret, and Duke waiting tensely below. The Cubs were secure in their enclosure, Ranger and Scout alert while Ember lay still, but breathing. "We need to move," Ryan announced, climbing down the wooden steps. Westfield brought reinforcements. Above them, the sounds of conflict intensified, shouted commands, gunfire, the crash of breaking furniture. Harrison and Stevens were fighting a delaying action, buying them time to escape. "There's a tunnel," Margaret informed them, her voice remarkably steady given the circumstances. "Old smuggler's route from Prohibition days. Leads to a boathouse on the cove about a quarter mile away." Ryan stared at her in surprise, and the older woman managed a grim smile. "You think a police captain's wife doesn't prepare for emergencies?" Mark insisted we have a backup plan when he realized how dangerous this Westfield character was. The tunnel was narrow but navigable, a relic from an earlier era when bootleggers had used the Long Island coast to move illegal alcohol. Ryan carried Ember's separate, smaller enclosure, while Sarah and Margaret managed the larger one containing Ranger and Scout. Duke trotted ahead, his keen senses alert for any danger. The journey seemed interminable, the sounds of conflict above fading behind them as they moved through the earth. The air was damp and cool, the passage lit only by the flashlight Margaret had thought to bring. "Almost there," Margaret assured them, after what seemed like an eternity of cautious progress. "The boathouse has a radio. We can call for help." When they finally emerged into the small boathouse nestled against a secluded cove, Ryan's first priority was securing the perimeter. Finding no immediate threats, he helped Sarah establish a temporary care station for the cubs, using the limited equipment they had managed to bring through the tunnel. "How is she?" he asked, watching as Sarah examined Ember. "Holding on," Sarah replied, her expression tense with concern. "But the stress of another move hasn't helped." Margaret had moved to the radio station in the corner, quickly establishing contact with a local Coast Guard station where she apparently had contacts through Stephen's work. 3 minutes out," she reported after a brief conversation. "They're sending a patrol boat." Ryan nodded, relieved at the prospect of reinforcement but deeply concerned about Harrison and Stevens, who remained at the cabin facing Westfield's mercenaries. He moved to the boathouse window, watching the dark waters of the cove for the approaching Coast Guard vessel. A soft whimper from Ember drew his attention back to the cubs. The smallest tiger had opened her eyes, her gaze finding Ryan across the room with that same determined expression he had come to recognize. Despite everything, she was still fighting. "That's it, little one," he encouraged softly. "Keep fighting." Outside, the distant sound of a boat engine grew steadily louder, approaching their position. Help was coming, but Ryan knew the danger was far from over. Westfield had demonstrated the extent of his resources and his ruthlessness. As long as the cubs remained alive as evidence, none of them were safe. But looking at Ember's defiant golden eyes, Ryan found his resolve strengthening. Some things were worth fighting for, no matter the cost. Emily had understood that. Now, finally, so did he. Folks, when Officer Ryan Mitchell looked into that tiger cub's eyes, he saw something we all recognize from our own journeys, that fierce determination to keep going when the odds are stacked against you. Like many of us who've weathered life's storms, losing loved ones too soon. Watching our country change in ways we don't always understand, Ryan found himself at a crossroads. Those 3 innocent cubs, trafficked like merchandise by wealthy men who already had everything, remind us of what truly matters. Remember how we were raised to protect the vulnerable, to stand up for what's right even when powerful forces push back. In our generation, we learned that some fights are worth the cost, whether in distant jungles, city streets, or quiet hospital rooms where we've held the hands of those departing too soon. Ember's story speaks to that place in our hearts where courage meets tenderness, where duty calls not from obligation but from love. In a world that sometimes seems to have forgotten the values we hold dear, this small tiger's refusal to surrender reminds us that the spirit that defined our finest hours still burns bright, waiting for us to answer its call.